Okay, on the list, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but Özge is not on the list, so we have 10 people officially or unofficially registered for the course, so there's still one more person who may or may not come, but let's start anyway. A few names have changed since we began last week on Thursday, so if you were not here Thursday last week and you don't have syllabus, can you put your hand up now and I can give it out? I hope I have enough for all of these extra people. Let me see if I've got a spare one here. Okay, one more for you here. I'll very briefly now say a few things about the course, but I was planning to start lecturing more formally today, so let's not spend too much time going over the syllabus again. But if there's any questions, or if you have any questions from last week if you were here, then you can ask them as we go through. So on the first page, you will see the list of my proposed topics that we'll be doing in the next 13 or 14 weeks together. And in about 10 minutes, we shall start by looking at the background to medieval British and Irish history with a brief survey of Roman Britain in today. And then on Thursday, 3 hours, we shall try and squeeze in almost 400 years of history. Next week, we shall begin looking at the process of the beginnings of medieval Europe with the migration of the Angles and the Saxons into Britain and so on. So look through those lists and see if there's anything there which interests you, because all of you will be doing one presentation during the semester. So I need you to choose your topic as soon as possible so you can start preparing. In addition, you will find a bibliography of general books on medieval British and Irish history in the library, listed there as a page and a half of those. They are good for starting to work on a topic. If you've chosen your topic, it might be something to do with Roman Britain or whatever it is, you can begin by reading some general books, a small chapter in 1 or 2 books to give you a brief overview, a background, and then using the more detailed bibliography I will give you later, you can then begin to focus in on whatever you wish to do. In addition, you will see the breakdown of things I'll expect you to do. I'll have to take this one while I'm improvising. My final grade, the final grade I will give you, will be determined according to 4 criteria. The first one is weekly readings and class-based discussions. Every week, I will give you a photocopy in translation of a primary document of some sort or other, which I'll expect you to try and read, have some ideas about, and the following week, probably depending on how the classes pan out on Thursday, we shall discuss. This is worth 30%. Oral presentation. Each of you, as I said before, will give a presentation once during the semester. Okay, so you need to pick your topic soon, and that's worth 20%. You will all write 1 term paper for the course. Now, as I said last week, this course was originally designed for the preparatory year in the history department who are moving into the MA program, and I designed it with them in mind. But in fact, we have now 3 people from that program, and the majority of you are from other departments. You are taking this as an elective from other departments. So if I'd realized this was going to happen, I might have rethought how we balance things out. But what we've got is 1 term paper. And what we're going to do is this. To avoid the disease of last-minutism, which I mentioned last week, this disease which affects all of us in Bilkent, of doing things at the last minute, I propose a schedule, a scheme of how we will go about working on your term papers together. So, for next week, Bayram Dan Sonra, on Thursday, I would like all of you to have had a little think about what you might be interested in writing your term paper on. Okay? I realize we haven't even started the course yet, so you haven't heard me and other people talking about the topics, but have a look through my list. think about what kinds of history you like. Do you like social history, political history, military? Cengiz, you told me you like military history last week, for example. You can at least come up with a very broad idea like that, or you can focus in a little bit more. But some suggestions, and I'll go around each of you next week asking for some ideas of what you might like to work on. Then we can begin working in my office hours together. Then I'll give you about a month, just before the holiday, just before my birthday, in fact. On the 27th of October, I would like you all to prepare a provisional bibliography, a set of articles and books, and if you want, academic websites, which are relevant to your topic and which you will be reading if you haven't read them already, and will give you ideas, plus some kind of an outline, a scheme, a plan, even if it's just a list of kind of mini chapters or something in which you wish to prepare your paper. Then again, about a month later, I'll expect some kind of draft, some kind of, not final, but draft version of the essay, based upon what you said here and my feedback, which I gave you in the class and perhaps in office hours as well. This doesn't have to be complete in any way, but it has to show you're moving in a certain direction. And then again, 1 month later, we finish about a month after that, at the end of December, we will negotiate the time, and I'm quite flexible about deadlines for essays, because I know you're all very busy. But I will expect some kind of final essay at that point, and we'll talk about that then. Okay. Right. Any questions there? Is that clear? Any problems? Okay, so the main one to remember, and for me to remember as well for next week, is that we'll have some time to discuss your topics then. This term paper will be worth 40%. Finally, as it says, 10% for attendance. Please come as often as you can, attend the class. If there is a medical reason or another serious reason, try and let me know in advance. If you're going to be missing a lot of hours, then you should certainly contact me before this happens, if possible, so we can talk about the problem and things like that. Again, the last-minutism disease we have means that sometimes I get people coming at the end of semester saying, oh, Hojam, I couldn't come for those weeks because of this, but then it's more or less too late. You haven't done one of these things, you've fallen behind, and however much I try, we may not get a good essay because we haven't got time to do it. So the sooner we can solve a problem of some sort together, the better it might be. Okay, I won't go through all the paragraphs here, but each paragraph says a little bit more about what I expect from you, particularly for the term paper and the presentation. You should have a look at these. Okay, any questions there? Anything you wish to check? Well, as soon as possible. Okay, good question. There's no presentation, well, unless someone wishes to volunteer for Thursday this week, which obviously wouldn't give you much time, so I'm presuming not. But anyone who wishes to give a presentation, for example, about Anglo-Saxon migrations, that's next week on Thursday, so you would have a week or so to prepare for that. But otherwise, the sooner you put your name down for something, the sooner you're guaranteed to get Vikings, and Azra won't get Vikings or something like that. It's the same deal we had last year in the prep year course. Any other questions? No? Okay. And finally, at the bottom, on the last page, there is a small section giving web resources. Okay. I've created a kind of online list of resources for historians. It's a little bit out of date these days. I'm so busy I haven't had time to keep it up, but there may be some useful links there. And Dr. Paul Halsell's Internet Medieval Sourcebook is quite a useful selection of primary sources and other material put on the web there. You might find some things there that might be useful to what you're doing. And then my contact details below. My email and my office numbers, both in the library and in the history department. I spend most of my time in the library these days. Office hours are Wednesday afternoons until 3:30. Okay, does that seem okay? No.
For you, if it's urgent, if you come to your office library.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, sometimes the secretary might say, oh, David Bay's in a meeting or something like that, shh, and stuff. Now, if it's very, very urgent, they can still come and let me know. If I'm just sitting in my office doing something, then that's no problem. Okay, no. And yes, I should add, for those of you who are not here and haven't been to my classes before, because I'm also library director, it does occasionally mean that classes can be interrupted or disrupted. I've been called away on occasion to give a short orientation at the library, and I've had to stop my class and depart or something, or in advance I'm aware of something. And obviously I'll try and let you know if I can't come. Check your Bilkent emails as often as possible. Hopefully that won't happen, but you never know, okay? Right, let's start with the class proper then. Again, for those of you who are not here, here is a short bibliography relating to Roman Britain. I've given you the Library of Congress LC range for the books relating to Roman Britain in the library, DA 143 to 147, and then there's a short selection of important books relating to the history of Britain during the Roman period. But if you go and look at in the library, you'll find some more detailed books. These are classic, famous ones. I have one here myself. Shepherd Frere's Britannia, which I've had for many years. It's a old but very important book. But most importantly, I don't think you'll find this in the library. I should mention this book, which is special to me because it's the book which started my love of history many, many years ago when I was somewhere down here or something. Julius Caesar and Roman Britain, a Ladybird book. It's one of these books from the 1950s and 60s in England, which had a historical, intellectual element and so on. And I had to do a project on Britain or something British history or something when I was about 7, and I chose to do Roman Britain because we had this book, and then after that I always loved history. So I lost my original copy, but I found this in a second-hand bookshop a few years ago, so just to share that one with you there. Okay, let's see if we can get this technology working. Here is a map of Roman Britain in the 2nd century. I showed this last week. It has the main political / tribal and administrative areas marked on, and we'll come back to this map more than once during the class, and I have another map to show in a minute. But firstly, now how do we do this? Escape. Let us move over here. What I'm going to do is have a very basic or elementary style PowerPoint show. I won't give you a lot of details here, but keywords and important images just to provide a kind of context for what I'm saying. So if you're taking notes, which I hope you all are, follow what you see here, but primarily listen to what I say and what I write on the board. I'm going to use PowerPoint in a sort of loose fashion. So, Roman Britain. We could, if we want, indicate that Roman Britain spanned this period, okay? 443 BC, when Emperor Claudius invaded, and one of the traditional dates, there's no real definite date, but sometimes people say, as we shall see shortly, that AD 410 was the year when Roman control or rule or administration in Britain was definitely over. Okay, so a little under 400 years of history, which is quite a long time, obviously. Roman Britain included most of what is now Britain. Let's shift back to that map, in fact, so we can just remind ourselves here. Up to somewhere here, very north of what is now England, or for a short while into southern Scotland as well, but not Ireland. Okay, so all of what is now England, apart from a little area here, all of Wales, but essentially most of Scotland not involved, and Ireland not involved. But we shall mention these areas as we go along. Okay, so this is the material we're talking about. This division here is between what's sometimes called the division between, if you can read this, the civil and military zones. The southern areas, both of England and of Wales, were relatively heavily Romanized, and they are called the civilian zones because they were part of the Roman world quite effectively. But until quite late, Roman presence in northern England and even northern Wales had a less strong, fixed control, and we sometimes call that the military zone. Okay, and we shall mention these divisions a little bit more as we go along. Okay, let's make a proper start then. Okay, why do we begin course on medieval British history by looking at Roman Britain, even if very briefly as we're doing today and on Thursday. I would suggest three answers to that question. Firstly, it is of course through the conquest by Claudius and the subsequent consolidation under him and his successors of Roman power in Britain that the British Isles, if we want to be very British-centric about it, Britain and Ireland, first would become in direct contact, particularly in the case of Britain, with what we might call Greco-Roman heritage, okay, the heritage of the ancient Greeks and then their successors, the Romans. So this involves things like literacy, in a large sense, law, and of course, most importantly, perhaps for the Middle Ages, the introduction on a large scale of the Latin language, which continued for well over 1,000 years as the main language for administration and culture as well. So it brings us into the Greco-Roman world, which therefore provides a continuity into the Middle Ages. Secondly, as part of that, following the conversion to Christianity by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, beginning of the 4th century, we see the spread of Christianity already spreading in the Roman world, but more effectively thereafter. And so by being part of the Roman world, Britain is therefore introduced to this spreading religious force, Christianity, which of course is an important aspect of medieval British history. One thing I should say at this point, I suppose, because I've encountered it more than once, many of my students in the past have said, oh, in the Middle Ages, Christianity, the church was the dominant power and the priests were oppressing the people and things like that. Things which allegedly people are told about at high school or whatever. Now, from a medievalist's perspective, that's a very kind of biased, or not so much biased, but kind of loosely incorrect interpretation. Obviously, Christianity was very, very important for people between the years 500 and 1000 AD, 1500 AD, but it doesn't have to be seen necessarily in this kind of negative, oppressive way. If there had been no Christianity, you could argue the Dark Ages would have been more dark. There would have not been the transmission of literacy and culture from the Roman world to the modern times and so forth. So the take I will have on this, and I'm not a religious person, this is not defending a religious context, but the take I will have is to see the positive role of Christianity in the church to a large extent. And obviously our job as historians is not to pass comment and to use words like oppressive or something, okay, but just to understand what things were like and why people did things, but without passing comment on them. And perhaps as a third point to make here, it's worth stressing that in the Middle Ages, from the early Middle Ages onwards, the Roman period was seen as, now maybe not so much a golden age, but as a great period. And in addition, people perceived a certain sense of continuity. They thought themselves as continuing Rome. The very earliest what you might call barbarian or sub-Roman rulers in Europe, for example, certainly thought themselves as continuing Roman rule. They didn't see themselves necessarily as significantly different from what had been going on before. And to some extent that's true, because the Roman period, spanning obviously over 500 years of history, was not a single monolithic homogeneous period, but had its changes and focuses as well. And what was going on in the late Roman period had a lot more in common with the early Middle Ages, perhaps, than what we had seen before. So again, not just from our perspective, these first 2 points, but also here, the people at the time will have perceived themselves as continuing Roman traditions. They were using Latin, they were using Roman law, they were Christian, and so on. So we are the ones who draw these periodization lines in, say, round about 400 or round about 500, we see the beginning of the Middle Ages or something, but they will have not perceived those lines themselves by any means. Okay, any questions there? Is that all clear? No? Okay, let's see what we have next. Can anyone remember what we said briefly last week about the peoples and languages of this period, particularly the Roman period and so on?
They are generally Celtic, and there are lines of Celtic language as if P Celtic and Q Celtic.
Right, okay, that's good, well done.
Q Celtic is some Irish and Scottish version of the Celtic, and the other one is more sort of in Britain.
Right, yes, okay, that's essentially it. Maybe I don't need to say anything, but I'll just repeat what you said just to, hang on, and show, go here, and put this map up, perhaps might be useful here. Prior to the arrival of the Romans and later the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, so this bit here we're talking about, the people living in Britain, the Britons, were probably in one way or another what we would now call as Celts. They spoke Celtic languages. Okay, don't pronounce this Celtic. That's a football team in Glasgow. And for the British Isles, for Britain and Ireland, but excluding the continent where they have less evidence of exactly the nature of the Celtic languages there, but for Britain and Ireland, we generally divide the peoples up into what we call Q Celtic, which is the Irish or Gaelic side, spoken still a little bit in Ireland and parts of the west of Scotland today, and P Celtic, which is spoken in parts of Wales, in the west especially, where I come from, for a while, but until a few hundred years ago, also spoken in Cornwall, but originally versions of this language probably spoken throughout most of what is Britain today, before the Romans come. Okay, but let's just call this one Welsh. And as I mentioned last week, Manx, which is spoken on the Isle of Man, is a Q Celtic language as well. So these people were, according to our definition, our understanding, Celts. We should be careful, however, that to use this word, because obviously this is a modern construct, the product of linguists in the 19th century. And the peoples of Britain and Ireland in the 1st century BC or 1st century AD would certainly have not thought themselves as Celts in any way. They would have seen themselves in somewhat different ways according to these tribal groupings, perhaps. And whether they even had a full sense of we are the Britons against the Romans, I'm not so sure of how strong our evidence for that is. So, leaving this map aside for the moment, let me just quickly jump back to here. And so Celtic peoples speaking Celtic languages by our modern definition, okay, but perhaps, as I said, seeing themselves more in terms of tribal groupings, thinking themselves in terms of their clans, their extended families, and what might in some cases have been confederations or federations, groupings of people who gained an identity and called themselves tribes in one way or another. It's difficult to study this period. We have some evidence in the form of archaeology, obviously, but historical evidence is quite thin on the ground. A few Roman writers, including Julius Caesar, discussed the peoples of Britain and of Gaul, their relations in northern Gaul, but exactly what was going on is hard to reach. We don't have enough evidence to make any very clear suggestions. But we have to think of them in terms of these tribal groups, these groupings of peoples, sometimes shifting and changing perhaps over time. And if I go back again to this map, and I'm sorry this is not a perfectly satisfactory way of doing things, jumping here and there, particularly in the late Iron Age period, just before, during the time when they were coming into contact more with Rome, in the southeastern areas, there was a lot of contact with northern Gaul, what's now France and other regions, and so-called Belgic peoples, connected to the name for Belgium, I guess, perhaps migrating over. So there was some population exchange and contact around here. And even some of the names, the Atra Bartes, we find a similar tribal name on Gaul somewhere, I think, and some other names as well, paralleled elsewhere. Whether there's a connection or not is hard to know, obviously. So here are some of the important tribal names, and we'll mention some of these later on. The Cantiaci are important. The name Canterbury in Kent, which is this region in England still, preserves them, and people would suggest kind of a grouping administrative continuity back to the past. Dumnoni here gives the modern word of Devon and so on. The Cantavaloni, very important people. Up here in Yorkshire and elsewhere, we have the Brigantes, very powerful and important people. And we shall also mention the Order Vices up here in central northern Wales, as it is today. So they were a Celtic people, on our perspective, organized in these great groupings, these tribal groupings as we call them today. In addition, they participated to some extent in what we call the Latin culture. This is an archaeological term. It's an Iron Age culture which spread from, I think it was Switzerland originally, and dominated a large part of Central and Western Europe, and continued into Britain and Ireland as well. We've got a few examples of Celtic/Latin art up there, I think. And so the peoples of Britain at this point were part of this broader cultural situation in Europe prior to the arrival of the Romans. In addition, in terms of their organization, what we can say about them, these tribal groupings, these groups, the names we saw before, usually seem to have had a ruler. In the Roman documents, he, and it was usually but not always a he, as we shall see, but usually called Rex, which means king in Latin. Okay, whether this is the application of a Roman and Latin word to something slightly different, of course, for the British people is hard to say, because we're only getting a picture of these people through Roman and through Latin. But that's the word used, so we sometimes describe these men as kings. Particularly in the southern regions, okay, these groupings were focused in the later period on a central place, a kind of capital, which is called an oppidum. It's oppida in the plural. Okay, they didn't all have this focus, a kind of proto-town, proto-urban settlement, but many of them did. And this was a kind of administrative and cultural and political and economic centre rolled into one, perhaps. In other areas, perhaps further when we get to the highland areas and so on, we still find people living primarily in fortified settlements on hills called hill forts, and these were often heavily fortified as well, I should say. The Romans, in many cases, took over the tribal regions as they spread their power in many regions, but in this case in Britain, and they would even take over an oppidum and turn it into a kind of Roman administrative capital, building their new town on top of the oppidum or close by and so on. Okay, so they're using existing patterns to spread their influence and to consolidate their power. Okay, very quickly then and very briefly, that's the Iron Age background. Any questions here? Anything you wish to ask? Joe? Did they have, sorry? Probably yes and no, I suppose. We're going to talk a bit about religion probably on Thursday, but these Iron Age Celtic peoples were what we would call pagan, polytheistic, perhaps is a less loaded term, which meant they worshipped more than one god. And we've got some evidence for their worship through written documents, but also archaeological finds. How far it was kind of common throughout the country, I'm not so sure of the answer to that question. Probably there were certain gods who were worshipped locally and some that were worshipped in different places and so on. It wasn't centralized. This whole area, this Britain and Ireland as well, was not a centralized administration. It was just these different groups overlapping and shifting and so on. So religion as well would have fitted into that. They had common cultural heritage going back centuries before we even know about them, and they inherited these beliefs and so on, and that's probably how it percolates through. But what, for example, people in Kent were believing compared to what people in northern Scotland were believing, I'm not so sure. Okay, similar but not exactly the same, I guess is probably the answer.
Was this religion or these religions show any hindrance at the time zone of Christianity, the conversion of Christianity?
Yeah, okay, we'll come to that question next time. Let's save that one for next time. That's an important point. Yeah, thanks for that. And if I do forget it, remind me, because I want to mention that point. Any other questions? Anything else? Okay, let's carry on. So what I'm going to do now is... what I'm going to do now is put this on. Is sketch very briefly a kind of chronology of Roman Britain. And then, depending on how far we get, probably on Thursday, we shall have a survey of aspects of life in Roman Britain. So let's go through this broad and brief chronology here. And again, we may or may not jump to and from the PowerPoint show to the maps. Okay, the background was the conquest of Gaul, which is equivalent to France and other regions today, by Julius Caesar, okay, Roman ruler. And we have a great account of this and his attempt to get into Britain in his book, The Conquest of Gaul. This is the Penguin translation I have there. In 550 BC, Caesar's contemplates, makes an expedition into Britain, a kind of foray, a kind of attempt to see what the situation is in southern Britain. Okay, and I think it's 556 or 555. And in 54 BC, he attempted what we think is a proper invasion, which is described in his book. For various reasons, problems the Romans had, but also things going on amongst the southern Britons, this invasion fails and he has to pull out. He has to go back to the continent and so on. So the first direct encounter of the Roman military force in Britain, in fact, failed. Okay, Julius Caesar, in that sense, failed, but it's not quite as simple as that. We haven't got time to go into that. However, later on, the Emperor Caligula, Gaius, apparently contemplated following through where Caesar had failed, but we don't have any evidence that this was put into effect in any way. But a couple of years later, his successor Claudius did mount an invasion of Britain. Okay, and essentially, we usually talk about. Let's take this date out here. The invasion started in 43 BC and continued through the consolidation period in southern Britain, carries on until about 47 BC. And gradually, Roman power was spread beyond that region. What the Romans did is they conquered some areas directly, and in other areas they kind of intimidated the local rulers to becoming what we sometimes describe as client kings. So these people retained their independence, they retained their status as king, rex, or whatever, over their tribe, over their people. But beyond that, they were paying perhaps tribute and recognizing the superiority of Rome. And often when, for example, a king died, the Romans might just then step in rather than allowing someone else to succeed to the client kingdom. So it was a kind of staged process. Rather than direct takeover, it took a few years while they allowed the client to keep in power. There was some resistance to Roman presence, of course, among the Britons, and some working with the Romans as well. Inevitably, this was not a unified region. So, for example, in 51 AD, Queen Cartimandua, who at that point was working with the Romans, gave up the rebel leader Caractacus to the Romans. That was an important kind of stage in building up Roman power. And a decade later, in 60 to 61, the Iceni peoples and the Trinovantes, and let's just remind ourselves where they are on our map. So this region here, okay, Iceni and Trinovantes, for different reasons, for differing reasons, rebelled against Roman rule. Boadicea, as she used to be called, now we correctly call her Boudica, was the wife of the deceased king of the Iceni, and she was rebelling against Roman pressure to take over their region. And the neighboring Trinovante tribe, okay, were objecting to, in part, to the building of a Roman colony planned to become a capital city on their old site Camalodunum. This had been an oppidum, this had been their central place, and the Romans took this over. It's now the English city of Colchester, and there was some resistance to this strong Romanization of their state, of their tribe, and the building of this city. This rebellion was eventually put down, of course, and again that strengthened the Romans' position over these peoples in the south. And then 69 AD, we see problems in the Roman Empire in general, and during that period the Brigante people in Yorkshire in the north took the chance to rebel, although they are eventually put down as well. The image there is of Claudius, I should add. Important step, an important development in Roman history in Britain during this time was the appointment of Gnaeus Julius Agricola as governor of the Roman province of Britannia, as it was called at that time. And we have a lot of information about Agricola and his successes in Britain because his son-in-law, Tacitus, the Roman writer, wrote an account of his father-in-law's deeds. So his period of governorship, less than 10 years, 78 to 85 AD, but was a period of significant Roman advance in Britain in various ways, as we shall briefly see. So immediately, Agricola defeats the Order Vicae people. They were the ones who were in kind of central and northern Wales, that still militarized area, were resisting Roman power in what is now Wales. So that's an important step in that part of the country, able to then push forward. He pushes forward into northern Britain, okay? And then we think in 82, there was the discussion, the possibility, the consideration, as he stood in what's now part of Scotland, of even attempting an expedition into Ireland, though this doesn't come to anything in the long run. And then the following year or so, okay, round about 83 to 84, he defeats the Scots, the Caledonians, as they're sometimes called, Scottish, what's now group in what is now Scotland, in a battle at Mons Graupius. And for a brief while, effectively was in a position to spread Roman rule up to the north of Britain as well. But then he's recalled back to Rome, and his successes in the north sort of fail, and the Roman border pulls back down to northern England where it had been before. But he achieved a great military successes, therefore, in spreading Roman power in Britain. Just to mention briefly a couple of things. In round about 1120, there was a significant wall built across Britain, the northern border between the Roman controlled military areas and the area beyond in Scotland they didn't control, which is generally called Hadrian's Wall, perhaps built under his direction. And again, if I close this, we can see where this is on the map. So this is the area of Hadrian's Wall, okay. About 20 years later, under the Emperor Antonius Pius, the Romans pushed their border up further into Scotland and built another wall known as the Antonine Wall, which you can see there. But this was short-lived, and within a decade or so, the border had been re-established at Hadrian's Wall there, which you can see on the map, as I said. And here we have a reconstruction of the wall as it may have looked, with this small kind of gateway set in, and then an image of what the wall looks like today. And I remember, let's see if I can find the picture in my book, in this old book of mine. There was a great picture in here. Okay, there's a picture of Hadrian's Wall, but there was a better picture somewhere of... No, I can't find it. There we go, yes. 2 Roman soldiers, legionaries or whatever, legionaries, standing probably on the wall up there in the north of England in the snow, and obviously dressed in traditional Roman military gear, suitable for Italy and perhaps southern France, but not so suitable for the northern parts of Britain. And you can't see this clearly, but this guy's got a very red nose. And I remember that from when I was a kid, thinking it was quite funny the guy had a red nose. So that kind of reflects, I suppose, some of the ways that the Romans adapted, and in this case didn't adapt to things. But this marking both presumably a kind of military frontier, but also a way of controlling movement between the Roman region, a military region of course primarily, and the tribes and peoples in what's now Scotland beyond, who were not directly under Roman rule. And remember this and think about this, and in a few weeks' time we'll talk about another wall, Offa's Dyke, which was built by the English to mark some kind of boundary with Wales. A few centuries later we'll discuss perhaps what these may mean. Okay, very briefly, some important dates during the 3rd and 4th centuries. Briefly, just before, at the end of the 2nd century, we see the division of Britain into 2 provinces, into 2 regions. We'll talk about that again when we look at the administration of Britain, probably on Thursday. Martyrdom, 208 or 209, the martyrdom of St. Albanus. Martyrdom means what? What does that word mean? If we talk about a martyr, you have a Turkish equivalent of that.
Basically, died in the name of his religion.
Yeah, or belief. I mean, I guess you can have political martyrs, but in general, a martyr is someone who dies or is usually sometimes killed because of their religious faith. So Saint Alban, okay, was one of these early Christians before the time of Constantine's conversion, before the time when Christianity becomes less persecuted and then eventually becomes the official religion of the Romans. We already had Christians in Britain, and here is a medieval depiction of the martyrdom of Saint Alban, okay, having his head cut off there, and rather gory image of his blood flowing off and so on. Obviously we don't have a picture of this from the 3rd century, but it does indicate, we pick out him, he's perhaps one of the earliest and most famous British Christian martyrs, but indicating the early spread of Christianity, relatively early, within the British Isles as well. Again, a product of being part of the Roman world in that sense. By 312, 314, the further administered division of Britain into 4 provinces, provincia, and again we'll talk about this later, as the level of administration and the spread of the civilian civil power becomes more important. And around about the same time, we have the first evidence of British bishops. Again, on the religious front, we have men attending, I think it's in Gaul, a synod or something, and they're called bishops from Britain. So the spread of not just the religious side of Christianity, but the administrative organisation going on as well. Any questions here? Anything not clear? Okay. Briefly, though, we'll be dealing with this again next week in the second topic, when we look at the sub-Roman and very early medieval period. Let's look at some of the main events which led to the end of Roman Britain. 3 kind of important dates worth mentioning here. Between 383 to 388, there is the rebellion of a guy called Magnus Maximus, who I think was from what is now Spain originally, but was based in Britain, general, and he wanted to attempt to become emperor. So using, and he wasn't the first to do this, using the troops he had under his power in Britain, he marched away from Britain, took many of the troops out to try and support his attempt to become emperor. So this marks the first significant evidence we have of the removal of some troops, not necessarily all of them, but perhaps a significant part of the Roman army from Britain at the end of the 4th century. Then we have some confusing events at the beginning of the 5th century, 408, 409, some evidence of a kind of rebellion by the Britons, perhaps amounting to an expulsion of Roman administrators from Britain. It's not clear exactly what was going on. And then we have a letter sent by the Emperor Honorius to the Britons, dated 410, in which he seems to be answering some request for support and help, and he's saying, no, sorry, we're too busy over here, we can't help you, you have to look after yourselves, we can't come back to Britain and help you out. So here it seems the Britons are getting rid of the Romans. Here, a year or so later, or maybe at the same time, they seem to be asking for help. It's not clear exactly perhaps what's going on. These are the things that historians discuss and argue about. But we see significantly, I think, this the end of both the military and also effectively the administration. So traditionally, the year 410 is seen as the end of Roman administration in what's now Britain. Okay, and things begin to shift in a new direction, in a new way thereafter. Okay, that ends our chronological survey. We have a number of themes to look at, administrative themes and so on, and since we've only got a few minutes left, I think we'll pick up on those on Thursday. In addition, on Thursday, we will discuss the Vindolanda tablets, which are an interesting and important source surviving from northern Britain under Roman rule. Again, those of you who are not here can take these away and have a read of this. Now, I think, Zainab, you said you had a go at this and found it a bit difficult or something. What was the problem? What was the... Well, you must have understood something. Let's have a look. Okay, some of them are fragmentary, so we don't get kind of continuous, complete sentences. Others are a little bit more clear, I think. And obviously you've got the Latin as well as the English translation, so you're not reading the Latin, I don't suppose. But do your best to have a read of this. It doesn't make great reading. It's not fun reading in the sense of reading a story or something. But then, as one of my professors when I was an undergraduate said, when I was complaining about working my way through lots of administrative documents, he said, but no one ever said history would always be interesting, David. But I had to carry on with that useful bit of advice. Think about what's going on. Think about what these documents are trying to do, what they tell us about the life of these people in northern Britain in the early Roman period. Okay, we can't reconstruct details and so on in a big way, but we can get some patterns, and I'm sure we'll get some things to think about. And we need to think a little bit about the methodology of how historians work with primary written sources as well. Any other questions? Any other problems? No? Okay, right. See you all on Thursday. Have a good 2 days, and happy reading.